last 25 years, the NHL has seen generational superstars, game changers, and Hall of Famers emerge from a single draft. But which class stands above the rest? We'll break down the greatest draft classes of the modern era, how they shaped the league, built dynasties, and left legacies still unfolding. Get ready. This is the Quarter Century Show presented by SAP. And joining me now for this healthy conversation about the draft classes, I welcome in Arda Ocal from ESPN, good friend, good to see you as always, and EJ Radick from the NHL Network, who has covered many NHL drafts over the years. So EJ, I'm going to start with you. And what criteria would you use to select such a difficult decision-making process to figure out which draft is the best of the last quarter century?
Yeah, I think for me the biggest thing is the games played. Like how many guys played games in the National Hockey League, because let's face it, not everybody who gets drafted is going to play in the league. So many of them don't. So when you go through each class, what are the number of individuals that were able to play a significant number of NHL games throughout the course of their career? That's one of the things that really weighed heavily for me.
Dominance and depth, the two Ds for me. How dominant were these players? How influential were they in their careers in the National Hockey League? But also, I love finding those diamonds in the rough. And I love it when we have a great story of a seventh rounder going on to have a really great career, winning a Stanley Cup and individual trophies. So that factors in for me as well.
And that can influence a draft. You know, when you think and you look back to the greatest drafts that we're going to be discussing here on this show, you know, some of those seventh rounders certainly make the decision-making process a little bit more challenging when you're trying to figure it out, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Henrik Lundqvist in 2000, I believe, was a seventh rounder. Joe Pavelski, seventh round pick. I mean, there have been a number of them over the years for different circumstances, different reasons, as the world has changed, as players come from different parts of the world. And, you know, obviously the scouting process now is so much different. I mean, we know about everybody now. We didn't, you know, and you go back into the, you know, the 90s and into the 2000s, there were still players that you didn't really know all that much about them, but now every stone seems to be unturned.
Yeah, I mean, you even have undrafted players like Jonathan Marchessault that are winning the Conn Smythe Trophy, right? But as far as draft classes go, it's really like, it's just such a feel-good story when you have a guy like Brian Elliott that was the second last pick in his draft, and he goes on to have an incredible career, right? Like how many people passed on him? How many people said, you know what, no thanks, and he proved them all wrong.
Yep, and that could have had an impact on his career as well when you're taken later and you have that little chip on your shoulder. All right, so we have plenty to unpack on this show. When we come back, we're going to dive right into it. Which draft ends up on top? You can stick with us to find out on the Quarter Century Show presented by SAP. And we welcome you back into the Quarter Century Show presented by SAP. And we're going to get right to it, guys, with who is definitely in the best of the best draft class from the last 25 years. Arda, I'm going to start with you. Who is your pick for this?
The start of the century and the 2010s, I feel like there are two draft classes that stand above the rest. But if I'm comparing the two, I have to go with 2003. I feel like it tops so many different categories. If you're looking at dominance, if you're looking at games played, if you're looking at trophies won, if you're looking at points and depth, it tops every single category. It doesn't have the superstar, like the generational talent that, let's say, a McDavid or a Crosby or an Ovechkin. Marc-Andre Fleury went first overall, which is a rare occurrence in itself. We did see it a few years prior with Ricky Pietro, but Marc-Andre Fleury becomes one of the great goaltenders of his generation. 29 of the top 30 players played at least 100 NHL games. 12 of 30 and 1,000 of the top 30 selected. Most cups with 28, most unique cup winners with 18. I mean, it's hard to bet against this draft class, EJ.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And, you know, when you think about where we sit now, the advantage that a class like 2003 has is that we've seen almost the whole window of that class, right? We've seen it all play out. And you mentioned that first round. I mean, I've covered so many drafts. You go back and look at first rounds, it's so rare that everyone has gotten to play, you know, at least two games. I mean, Hugh Jessamine was a Rangers pick, 12 overall. Didn't go well. Obviously, that was one of the big disappointments of that draft. But everybody in the first round played at least those two games, and several played many more. They were just impactful in so many ways. And go to the second round. Patrice Bergeron, 45th overall, impacted the Boston Bruins for for 2 decades, and that was after a slow start because of injury issues earlier in his career. So the draft can impact a team for not just 5 years, but for maybe 10, 15, 20 years, as we've seen with some of the players from that class.
Yeah, and you see the influence of a player like a Patrice Bergeron for generations to come. I mean, the footprint of that Bruins team, right? The way they play, the style they play, the leadership example that was set by a Patrice Bergeron continues to permeate throughout that lineup, even with him being retired. So it's really interesting to see certain members of that draft class. You know, who kind of was a surprise in that draft class that maybe surpassed expectations with their career afterwards?
Well, Joe Pavelski's got to come to mind right away. He's a 7th-round pick that had a long career, was one of the great goal scorers in the league. And, I mean, I don't think anybody was thinking when Joe Pavelski got picked in the 7th round, boy, we better hold on here. I mean,
we're going to raise his number to the Raptors one day.
That's right, and he's going to be such a great player. So there's such a deep class, and Pavelski for me stands.
Yeah, Dustin Byfuglien was picked 245th in the draft. We mentioned Brian Elliott. He was second last in the draft. He had an incredible career. Yaroslav Halak was picked in the later rounds. Like, that's, to me, like, that's a big thing. I love when you see that depth across many rounds. There were a few rounds where it didn't really produce any NHL players of note in this class, but when you look at how top-heavy it was, but then when you see in the later rounds, the last couple rounds, players that went on to formidable careers, that's what puts it over the top.
It impacts your franchise for decades in the way things are going to play out. When you go back to 2003 again for the New York Rangers, it was a miss. They still had great teams that went on to go to a cup final, but maybe if there's a different pick there, maybe that's a team that goes on and wins Stanley Cups. It changes the trajectory of a franchise for years and years. So that's why it's so important. And when you get a great draft class like 2003 or some of the others we're going to talk about, I mean, you want to be successful. You don't want to miss.
When you're failing to mention a player like Shea Weber, who's also drafted in this class, you have a pretty deep draft class.
Another second rounder.
Yeah.
When you look at, and EJ, you speak to so many general managers when you're on that draft floor covering the draft, like what are some of the intangibles that they're looking for when you think about the later picks in the round? You know what a Marc-Andre Fleury is going to bring to your organization and the top guys, but when you're looking at a Dustin Byfuglien, you're looking at a Brian Elliott, what are some of those intangibles that they say, you know what, this guy could fit in our organization?
Well, I think that the biggest thing is identifying who you are, as in any business really, but certainly in sports. Who are we as a team? I thought the Red Wings, you know, for years they get a Doc suit, they get a Zetterberg, those picks were, you know, earlier on, but those guys, they were talented players, but the Red Wings had an identity. They were a skilled team. So smaller guys, they had skill. We liked them because we're a skilled team. They could fit with us. I know talking to Julian Brisbois with the Tampa Bay Lightning, he talks about being a bolt. And so I followed up, what does that mean? He says, well, we look at guys that are really ultra competitive, that are smart, that if they're in our system, they can be a bolt. They could be a member of our team and they could thrive in that system. So when you can identify who you are as a franchise and what you're trying to be, when you're starting to narrow down picks, it makes it easier. If you want to be a bigger, stronger, nastier team, like Bill Guerin likes to have big, tough teams. Brian Burke in the past, big, strong teams. When you're sitting at that draft table and you see a bigger player, you might lean towards that guy as opposed to the Red Wings who might have leaned towards that skill guy. So this is the way you could separate players a little bit there.
That's a really good point. So to that end, about identifying what you need. The Pittsburgh Penguins didn't have the first overall pick that year. They traded for it, right? And so they knew they wanted Marc-Andre Fleury. They were willing to give up their spot in the draft to get it. And the Florida Panthers had their eyes on Nathan Horton. They said, we think we will get him at the pick that we will trade for. It worked out in that moment for those players, and the Penguins end up getting a generational goaltender.
When you look at the 25 years from start to finish, 2000 to 2025, I mean, so many things have changed the way the game is being played as well. But, you know, you still need those big players. You still need, right? It seems like the core and the essence of the game is still recognized at the NHL draft.
You know what's funny to me, Catherine? I've watched the game, and these 25 years has changed, where we went through the work stoppage and the rule changes. And the smaller player got more opportunity to be successful, because I can remember going back to my scouting days, and Marty St. Louis was playing at the University of Vermont, and scouts would say, you got to go see him play. He's terrific. And I say, well, what team's he going to be on? He goes, oh, he'll never play in the NHL. He's too small. And then, obviously, Marty was a unique player and went on to become a Hall of Famer. But the smaller player was getting more opportunity. Now what I've noticed over the last 10, 15 years is with skill development, the bigger player is now equally skilled to some of those smaller guys now. So we're seeing the Austin Matthews, who has the great shot, the great skills, some of these bigger guys who have great skills. So the game, I think, is kind of moving in that direction again. So it's always changing, it's always moving. I always think it's about information when it comes to the draft, too. Is like, you have to have information. Tampa Bay had a lot of information on Braden Point, and they ended up trading up to get him, and he's become a star player for them. But, like, again, they had the right people in the right place and did the work, and it was something that played out for them.
The value of those later round picks has increased exponentially over the years. Yeah, I actually wonder how influential 03 was for that whole paradigm. I wonder how teams and scouts looked at those later rounds, like just valued them even more than they used to, given how many diamonds were found in those later rounds.
You know what's funny, too, is like now, you talk to managers, you talk to assistant GMs, with analytics being such a part of hockey now, is they have a real value on all. They trade draft picks. Like, number 73, they have a value. They have a board. They look at, okay, this is what this is worth. Number 87, this is what this is worth. So that's another way this has changed dramatically over, particularly in the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years, is that those picks, they've gone to work with the math and done the work on trying to figure out exactly what works. And like teams that are willing to trade picks for players, they know really what the value they think they have in those particular picks.
Yeah, fascinating, and a true testament to the scouting departments as well for all the franchises in the NHL. All right, now that we know the very best of the best, which ones are sitting right on the verge of greatness? We'll take a look when we return on the Quarter Century Show, presented by SAP, an official technology partner of the NHL. And we welcome you back to the Quarter Century Show, presented by SAP, as we continue to unpack this draft class special. Over the last 25 years, we've already established that the 2003 draft class was the best of the last 25 years. But who perhaps was on the cusp? Arda, you mentioned in the last segment that there was another class that you thought might challenge 2003. What are your thoughts on that?
It was 2015 for me. Yeah. That was my choice in the 2010s. And that one, obviously, you have McDavid and Eichel leading the way, right?
Yeah.
And we were just talking about it. Jack Eichel, in pretty much every other draft class, save for a couple, could have been number one overall.
Yeah.
But then you have Connor McDavid. So, but that draft class produced a lot of great talent as well.
Yeah, no question about it. I mean, you had Marner, you had Rantanen. I mean, you go down the list. We haven't even seen that full window of that draft class, right? Because Jack Eichel and Connor McDavid, you take of them, that's the year, right? They're still kind of in the middle of their careers. So there's more to come for all the players that were drafted in that class, and there's still players that could even emerge at this late date and become more impactful to winning, and maybe winning a Stanley Cup, or maybe even winning on the international stage.
Yeah, we have a lot of stars, right, in the top 20, or even just in the first round, the Matt Barzals of the world.
Kyle Connor. I mean, you go right on down the list.
Like, it's just like a lot of really great offensive threats.
We're going to come back in 15 years and determine what the outcome of that 2015
I hope so.
class
I hope
was.
so.
That's right.
We're doing that show on a beach.
What about for you? Aside from maybe 2003 and 2015, what other class
I
stands
think
out to you?
2008 is another class that is a terrific, terrific class. I mean, you have really high-end players throughout. It starts with Steven Stamkos at the top, who's a great goal scorer, and then you had Drew Doughty, you have Alex Pietrangelo. I mean, those are some high-end players. A funny story about LA Kings, they drafted Doughty with the second pick, and then they had another pick at 13. And he said, we felt we needed some toughness, so they took a guy, Colton Tubert, who never really played that much in the National Hockey League. 2 picks later, Erik Karlsson went to the Ottawa Senators. So you think about it, LA could have had Doughty and Karlsson in the same draft year, which would have been kind of mind-boggling to have them both selected by one team in the same year. But for me, 2008 was a pretty good year.
But speaking of that, wasn't there like maybe the Boston Bruins, maybe 2015?
They
have
had
three
in a row.
And they had like opportunities.
Yeah.
I don't want to open a can of worms here, Kate.
Well,
That's not me.
you know what I always say, because the Bruins are a huge, a big market team. They picked Pastrnak in 2014, and they really did well later in the first round. 2015, they had the 3 picks in a row, didn't do as well. So it's kind of, at the end of the day, did good one year, not as good the next.
But what's really interesting about that 2008 draft class, and you talked about it, Steven Stamkos going first. We know Doughty went second defense, but then it went 2, 3, 4 for defensemen, Zach Bogosian, Alex Pietrangelo, and Luke Shen. So very interesting that it was a top-heavy, defense-oriented draft that year. You know, it kind of makes you wonder, you know, where general managers were going with regards to understanding how they wanted to build out their team, and with such star players at the top being available at the defense position, which we know is crucial to winning a Stanley Cup championship. It's just very interesting to look at that.
Every year it can be a little different, and you know there's years when they get on those runs of defensemen.
Roman Josi also part of that
Roman
draft.
Josi,
Yeah, we
Eric
haven't even
Carr.
mentioned him.
That is decisively a definitive defenseman draft, and they went on to have great careers in the league.
All right. Well, we are going to continue the conversation. We've got the cream of the crop. We've got those who are on the cusp. But who were perhaps some of the snubs? We're going to break it all down for you on the Quarter Century Show presented by SAP, an official technology partner of the NHL. We welcome you back to the Quarter Century Show presented by SAP with Arda and EJ, discussing the best draft classes of the last quarter century. And you guys gave me the criteria off the top of the show for the best of the best. And you mentioned 2003 and what went into your thought process for that. So now we're going to be talking about snubs. I'm curious what the criteria is for a snubbed NHL draft class.
Well, I think it's. I think it might be a class. It gets overlooked, and we've been talking a little bit about this. Is that when people project ahead to those generational players, like Connor McDavid was on the radar for years before he was drafted in 2015. So therefore, we look at a 2014 draft. Maybe it flies under the radar a little bit. You go back to when Sidney Crosby was in 05. I mean, everybody was looking to Sidney Crosby years. I remember interviewing him when he was like 16. So sometimes those years that are in between that generational player and when he's actually drafted, sometimes those draft years get overlooked.
Yeah, they certainly do. I think recency, Catherine, we are snubbing the 2024 draft class hard
Yes, we
on
are.
this show. How dare we do
Yes,
that, EJ?
yes.
How dare we?
Well, we could dare to do it. I mean, why not? I mean, you know, those kids are young.
Yeah, exactly.
To be
I'm
determined.
just gonna look
Yeah.
at social media and see who trolled us. and
Exactly.
said,
There you
pick
go.
that year.
And have
That's
that one.
right.
All right. So along those lines, then, EJ, I'll start with you. Who is the snubbed class of the last 25 years?
Well, I mean, one of the ones that I looked at was 2017, in particular at the top. I mean, Hischier went at number 1 overall, but the two defensemen that went 3 and 4, Heiskanen 3 and then Makar at 4. I mean, those guys are on track really to be Hall of Fame type players. And Cale Makar, I mean, I don't know, you dare say someone could be in the same sentence with Bobby Orr? I think Cale Makar, numbers-wise, we've already seen that his name has been linked with Bobby Orr in the ability to generate offense from defense at this early stage of his career. So he has been a magnificent player. So I think, you know, in that way, in that 17 class, and the Dallas Stars would certainly love it because they had Ottinger that year, they had Robertson that year. There was a lot of good players in that class as well.
I don't think it's out of the ordinary anymore to compare Cale Makar to Bobby Orr.
Yeah, yeah.
It may have been jarring the first time just
Yeah.
because of the gravitas of
Yes.
Bobby Orr, but it happens so often now
Yeah.
that it just seems commonplace. And he keeps proving us right
Yeah.
by making those comparisons.
yeah.
I agree with you. That's the degree of player that we're talking about there. If I'm looking at a draft class that I believe is getting a snub, certainly because we've been talking about the 2003s of the world and the 2015s of the world. For me, the year before, to your point exactly about how much we were talking about Connor McDavid, 2014 had a wealth of talent. You have the likes of Leon Draisaitl and David Pastrnak to start, by
Yeah,
the way.
yeah.
William Nylander, Sam Reinhart,
Yeah.
Braden Point that you mentioned earlier on the show. And how about the goaltenders? Igor Shesterkin, Ilya Sorokin, Thatcher Demko, 3 starting goaltenders, 3 goaltenders that could be franchise goalies when it's all said and done for their teams.
Yeah, I mean, you could certainly make an argument for both those classes. And I think, too, you know, you guys mentioned it a little bit already, but the hype surrounding some of these top draft picks, right? Like, for example, a Connor McDavid year. We know he's going to go number 1. We've been talking about him since he was 12, 13, 14 years old, right? Can that affect the following year's draft class when maybe it's not quite a generational talent like a Connor McDavid being drafted, but it could potentially be someone else that we're not looking at?
Yeah, you know, I think whenever it's not a generational talent, and we use that phrase for a reason, it often isn't, we do overlook it. And we're looking to the future, and we're bypassing all the things that are right in front of us. I mean, the Connor Bedard draft in 2023, that was a big deal. Connor Bedard was someone that was on the radar for a while. I mean, we were talking prior, Arda, about the fact that, really might have been since McDavid and Matthews, we had a name that was covered, certainly a draft player that was covered like Connor Bedard was. But, when I think of that class now, we're only into the second year past there, right? Think about Ryan Leonard, who was ripping it up at Boston College, going to the Washington Capitals. I mean, the Capitals are going to be in the playoffs this year. Ryan Leonard probably joins them during the playoffs. He could be somebody that has a lot of impact this year. And this wouldn't even be in his official rookie season. So there's so much ground to cover with some of these younger classes that, time will tell where they're all going to play out. But that's just one example.
Yeah. To the point about overlooking draft classes and the talent that came out of even certain eras, that 3-year stretch from 2014, 2015, and then 2016, we could have easily forgotten the 2016 draft because of Connor McDavid, but here comes Austin Matthews.
Right. Yep.
Unbelievable the amount of star power and the amount of depth and quality players that we got in that 3-year span. We just talked about 2014 being a snub. 2015 is the McDavid year. 2016 is the Matthews year. I mean, what an embarrassment of riches.
And it goes to show when, the time it takes to develop. Those guys were still, Connor McDavid got to the Stanley Cup final last year, still trying to win a Stanley Cup. Austin Matthews hasn't even gotten to a conference final yet, still trying to get there.
Don't remind me, Vince.
Yeah, I mean, but these are the things. They are still in the middle of their career. This is 10 years down the road now in some of these cases. So the draft impacts franchises in such a dramatic way for so long. And these guys have a whole second act of their career to play out.
Well, guys, I'm not going to ask you to look into your crystal ball of what we can expect 2024, 2025 draft to look like years from now. But it's been great getting your expertise on the last 25 years. And thank you both for joining us today.
This was fun.
It was fun. All right, remember, fans can chime in on who they think are the top players of the past 25 years. The vote goes until April 1st, so log on to NHL.com/vote or visit the NHL on X to make your voices heard.
Simply sensational! One of sports' great moments.
Make sure to catch us next time as we continue to break down 25 incredible years of NHL hockey, only on the Quarter Century Show presented by SAP.